The first time I saw them, I thought they were just another couple of retirees enjoying the park. They looked like they'd stepped out of an old photograph. He had a neatly trimmed gray beard, and she wore a wide-brimmed hat that shaded her weathered face. They weren't like the usual visitors who came with cameras slung around their necks, eager to snap a few pictures and leave. No, they seemed to move with purpose, scanning the landscape as if searching for something specific. I didn't approach them at first. I've learned over the years that some people come to these places to find a bit of peace, and the last thing they need is a ranger asking if they need directions. But over the next few days, I kept seeing them. They'd arrive early in the morning and stay until late afternoon, always in the same area, always looking around. Curiosity got the better of me, so I finally went over to say hello. They introduced themselves as George and Evelyn, visiting from out west. They told me that decades ago, George had proposed to Evelyn in this very park. Back then, it was just a quiet spot in the woods, not yet a designated park. They'd taken a few photos to mark the occasion, and now, years later, they were trying to find the exact spot where George had asked Evelyn to marry him. But things had changed since then, and they were having trouble recognizing the landscape. When they showed me the old, faded photographs, I could see why they were struggling. The trees had grown taller, paths had shifted, and time had worn down the details they remembered. But something about their story touched me. Maybe it was the way they looked at each other, or the way they spoke about that day with such fondness. I felt a sense of responsibility to help them find this place that meant so much to them. I offered to take them in my ranger vehicle to a trailhead that I thought might lead us close to where they needed to go. They were hesitant at first, not wanting to be a burden, but I insisted. After all, it was a quiet day, and I had the time. So we set off, their excitement palpable as we drove along the winding roads. I could tell this meant everything to them. When we reached the trailhead, I helped them out of the vehicle, and we began our hike. The path was overgrown in places, but George and Evelyn pressed on without complaint. Every few minutes, they'd stop and look around, trying to match what they saw with their memories. Finally, after about an hour, we reached a clearing. Evelyn gasped and clutched George's arm. "This was it," she said. "This was the place." I stood back as they took it all in, letting them have their moment. I watched them for a while, standing quietly as they reminisced. George knelt down, brushing his hand over the ground, as if he could still see the blanket they'd spread out for a picnic so many years ago. Evelyn was looking at the trees, her eyes tracing the branches like she was searching for something familiar. I could see the weight of time in their faces, but there was also something light in their expressions, like they'd found a piece of themselves that had been lost. After a bit, I told them I'd head back to the station. They assured me they'd be fine, that they just wanted to spend a little more time there. I nodded, knowing how much this moment meant to them. Before I left, I pointed out the trail they should follow to get back to their car, and George thanked me with a firm handshake. I could tell he was grateful, not just for the help, but for understanding how important this was. The walk back was peaceful, the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own thoughts. I thought about how special it must be to share a bond that strong, to come back to a place where it all began, and find that the memories are still alive, even if everything else has changed. When I got back to the station, I sat down and went over some paperwork, trying to keep busy until they returned. Hours passed, and the sun started to dip lower in the sky. They still hadn't come back. I started to feel uneasy, wondering if maybe they'd gotten turned around on the trail. I waited another hour before deciding to head back out. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. They were older, and even though they seemed in good spirits, it wouldn't take much for one of them to stumble or get exhausted. I grabbed my gear and set out again, moving quickly along the path we'd taken earlier. When I reached the clearing, it was empty. The air felt still, like the whole forest was holding its breath. There was no sign of George and Evelyn, just the rustling of leaves and the fading light. I called out their names, but there was no answer. I walked around the area, looking for any trace of them, but there was nothing. It was like they had just vanished. A sinking feeling settled in my chest as I realized they weren't going to walk out of the woods on their own. I radioed back to the station, reporting that I couldn't find them. I could hear the concern in my colleague's voice as he said he'd send someone to help search. I stayed there, pacing the clearing, waiting for the backup to arrive, trying to figure out what could have happened. I kept thinking, they were right here. Where could they have gone? The backup team arrived quickly, and we split up to cover more ground. I led them back to the spot where I'd last seen George and Evelyn. We scoured the area, calling their names, checking every path they might have taken. The more we searched, the stranger it felt. There were no footprints, no disturbed brush, nothing to suggest they had moved from that spot. It was like the forest had swallowed them whole. I couldn't shake the image of them standing there, so connected to that place. It had seemed so peaceful, but now it felt eerie, like we were chasing ghosts. The search went on for hours, but as night fell, we had to stop. The darkness brought a chill that seemed to seep into my bones, and I couldn't help but feel a deep unease. It didn't make any sense. People don't just disappear like that. Back at the station, I reported everything to my supervisor. He was concerned, but tried to reassure me that they'd probably just gotten lost and we'd find them in the morning. I wanted to believe that, but something kept nagging at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something, that there was more to this than just a couple of lost hikers. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. The next morning, we resumed the search at first light. We brought in more people, combing through the area with dogs, but the results were the same. No signs, no clues, just an empty clearing. It was as if George and Evelyn had never been there. The whole situation was starting to feel surreal, and I could see the frustration on everyone's faces. We were all thinking the same thing, but no one wanted to say it out loud. Something was very wrong. As the day dragged on, an older man who often fished in the area stopped by the station. He overheard us talking and asked me about the couple I was looking for. When I described them, his face went pale. He told me that he'd heard of a couple who matched their description, but they had died years ago in these woods. According to him, the woman had been terminally ill, and they had come back to this place to spend their final moments together. I didn't want to believe it, but the way he spoke, the certainty in his voice, made my blood run cold. I tried to brush it off, told myself it was just a story, but the way he looked at me before he left, like he knew something I didn't, stuck with me. I went back to the clearing one last time before dark, standing there alone, feeling the weight of the silence. The thought crossed my mind that maybe, just maybe, I had led them to the place they were meant to go, a place where they could finally be at peace. It was a comforting idea, but it didn't erase the chill that had settled deep inside me. I couldn't stop thinking about what the old man said. His words stuck with me, echoing in my mind every time I walked through those woods. It didn't help that we never found a trace of George and Evelyn. The search officially ended after a week, but I couldn't let it go. I went back to that spot every day, retracing my steps, hoping I'd missed something. Each time, the clearing seemed to grow quieter, almost like it was holding its breath. One afternoon, while I was out there alone, I found myself talking to the empty space where they had stood. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I was desperate for answers. I asked them where they had gone, if they were all right, if they needed help. The silence that followed was heavy, as if the whole forest was listening. I waited, feeling ridiculous, but also strangely certain that something would happen. And then, just as I was about to give up and head back, I saw it. The smallest movement at the edge of my vision. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. My heart pounded, and I stood frozen, staring into the trees. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The forest felt different, charged with a presence I couldn't explain. I left the clearing that day with a knot in my stomach. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen, partly because I wasn't sure what it was myself, and partly because I knew how it would sound. I barely slept that night, tossing and turning, my mind racing with thoughts of George and Evelyn. I kept picturing their faces, the way they looked at each other with such love. It was hard to believe they were gone, that they could just disappear without a trace. But then again, maybe they hadn't disappeared. Maybe they were still out there, somewhere beyond my reach. The next day, I returned to the clearing, determined to figure out what had happened. I spent hours there, searching every inch, looking for any sign of them. The strange thing was, the more I searched, the more I felt like they were close, just out of sight. I could almost hear their voices, soft and distant, carried on the wind. It was enough to make me question my sanity, but at the same time, it felt real, like they were still here, waiting for something. As the sun began to set, I stood in the middle of the clearing, feeling defeated. I knew I couldn't keep doing this, but I also knew I couldn't stop. The mystery of what happened to George and Evelyn had taken hold of me, and I wasn't sure I'd ever find peace until I knew the truth. Before I left, I whispered a promise into the stillness. I'd keep looking, keep searching, until I found them, or until they found me. Then, with a heavy heart, I turned and walked back to the station, the weight of their disappearance pressing down on me like never before. A few days later, something strange happened. I was in the office, going through the usual paperwork, when a visitor showed up. It was the old man who had told me about George and Evelyn. He looked at me with those same piercing eyes and said he had something to show me. I didn't know what to expect, but I grabbed my coat and followed him out to his truck. We drove in silence, the tension between us thick. He didn't say where we were going, but I recognized the route. We were heading back to the clearing where I'd last seen the couple. The closer we got, the more uneasy I felt. When we arrived, he parked the truck and got out, gesturing for me to follow. We walked to the spot where I'd left them, and the old man pointed to a cluster of rocks I hadn't noticed before. "Look there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I crouched down and started moving the rocks aside. Underneath, I found a small, weathered box, the kind you'd see in an old movie. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside, there were a few photos, yellowed with age. One of them was of George and Evelyn, smiling, holding hands in that very clearing. But it wasn't just any picture. It was taken the day they got engaged, right where we stood. I recognized the trees, the slope of the land. Everything matched. I looked up at the old man, my mind racing. How did this get here? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out at the trees, as if seeing something I couldn't. "They wanted you to find it," he finally said, "to let you know they're all right." I didn't know what to say. The whole thing felt surreal, like I was caught in some kind of dream. But the box, the photos, they were real, solid in my hands. I knew then that George and Evelyn had never really left. Somehow, they were still here, in this place that meant so much to them. It was as if the forest had held on to them, keeping them safe, preserving their love in a way I couldn't understand. We stood there for a while, the old man and I, just taking it all in. There was a peace in the air, something I hadn't felt since they disappeared. It was like they'd found what they were looking for, and in a way, so had I. When we finally left, I took the box with me, not as evidence, but as a reminder. A reminder that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, and some stories don't end the way you expect. As we drove back, I felt a strange sense of closure. I knew I'd never forget George and Evelyn, but I also knew that I could finally let them go. The forest had given me an answer, just not the one I was looking for, and maybe that was enough. I've been working as a forest ranger in northern Idaho for nearly a decade. My job is straightforward: patrol the woods, make sure everything's in order, and keep an eye out for any signs of trouble. Most days, it's just me and the trees. It's quiet out here, almost too quiet at times, but I've always found a sense of peace in the solitude. The forest is vast, stretching for miles with no sign of civilization, just the occasional animal crossing my path. Every morning, I gear up and head out in my old truck, driving along the narrow dirt roads that twist through the dense woods. There's a rhythm to my days, one I've grown used to. I check on campsites, make sure no one's been messing with the trails, and sometimes I'll run into a hiker or two. But mostly, it's just me. I like it that way. There's a certain predictability to it, and I've come to rely on that. One afternoon, though, something changed. I was out on a routine patrol, nothing special, when I caught sight of something unusual. Standing just off the trail, in a small clearing, was a young girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, wearing a white dress that seemed out of place in the woods. She didn't move, didn't say a word, just stood there, staring at me with wide eyes. I slowed the truck to a stop, my heart picking up a bit. It's not every day you see a child out here alone. I called out to her, asked if she was lost, but she didn't respond. I got out of the truck, took a few steps toward her, but the moment I did, she turned and walked deeper into the trees. I hesitated, unsure if I should follow. Something about the way she moved, so calm and deliberate, sent a chill down my spine. But she was just a kid, right? I couldn't just leave her out there. I radioed in, let them know I might have a lost child in the area, and then I started after her. But when I reached the spot where she'd been, she was gone, no sign of her anywhere. I searched the surrounding area, called out her name, though I didn't know what it was. Nothing. It was like she'd vanished into thin air. Eventually, I had to give up, though it didn't sit right with me. I figured she must have found her way back to her family, but something about the whole thing nagged at me. That night, as I sat in my small cabin at the edge of the forest, I couldn't shake the image of that girl from my mind. Her face, pale and expressionless, kept popping up in my thoughts. It was strange, but I chalked it up to a long day and tried to push it out of my head. Still, when I went to bed, I made sure the doors were locked tight. Maybe it was just my imagination, but the woods outside felt a little less welcoming than they had before. The next day, I went back to the same spot, hoping to find some clue, footprints, a piece of clothing, anything. But there was nothing. Just the same stretch of trees and silence. I didn't report it to anyone. What would I even say? I saw a girl who then vanished without a trace? No one would believe it, and I wasn't sure I believed it myself. But deep down, I knew something was off. And I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The days that followed were unsettling, to say the least. I kept returning to that clearing, hoping I might spot the girl again, or at least find some clue to explain what had happened. But the woods were as empty as ever. I couldn't get her out of my head, though. It was like she'd imprinted herself on my mind, her pale face and that white dress lingering in my thoughts. A week later, I saw her again. It was late in the afternoon, and I was wrapping up my patrol when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. There she was, standing just off the trail, exactly where I'd seen her before. Same dress, same blank expression. She didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at me like she was waiting for something. I stopped the truck and got out, my heart racing. This time, I didn't hesitate. I walked straight toward her, calling out, asking if she was all right. But just like before, she turned and disappeared into the trees. I broke into a run, determined not to lose her again, but by the time I reached the spot where she'd been, she was gone. No sound, no movement, just the rustling of the leaves underfoot. It was like she'd melted into the forest. I searched the area for nearly an hour, circling back to that same clearing over and over, hoping to catch a glimpse of her again. But there was nothing. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees, and the air had that crisp, cool bite that comes with dusk. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that she was out there, hiding, just beyond my line of sight. When I finally gave up and headed back to the truck, I couldn't help but feel a creeping unease. This wasn't just some lost kid anymore. There was something wrong here, something that didn't make sense. I thought about reporting it, but what would I even say? That I'd seen a ghost? I wasn't ready to go down that road, not yet. But deep down, I knew this wasn't normal, and it wasn't something I could just ignore. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing there, her eyes locked on mine. I couldn't get her out of my head, no matter how hard I tried. It was like she'd taken up residence in my mind, haunting me even when I was awake. And for the first time in years, I found myself dreading the thought of going back into the woods. By morning, I was a mess. My routine, the one I'd relied on for years, suddenly felt meaningless. The forest, once a place of solitude and peace, had become a source of anxiety. I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And whatever was going on, it was only going to get worse. The next few days were a blur. I went through the motions at work, but my mind was always somewhere else. I kept seeing her in the corners of my vision, just a flicker of white among the trees, but when I'd turn to look, she'd be gone. It was driving me crazy. I'd never been one to get spooked easily, but this was different. There was something about her, something that felt off, like she didn't belong in this world. It wasn't long before she started showing up at my house. The first time it happened, I was out back, chopping firewood. I glanced up, and there she was, standing at the edge of my yard, right where the forest begins. She was just watching me, the same blank expression on her face. My heart nearly stopped. I dropped the axe and stared at her, waiting for her to move, to do something, but she just stood there. I didn't know what to do. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. After a few seconds, she turned and walked into the trees, just like before. I wanted to follow her, to figure out what was going on, but something held me back. Instead, I stayed where I was, rooted to the spot, until the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness swallowed the yard. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, just beyond the trees, watching. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made me jump. I double-checked the locks on the doors, something I hadn't done in years. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, trapped by my own fear. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was filled with nightmares of that pale face staring at me. The next morning, I was exhausted, but I had to keep going. I couldn't let this thing, whatever it was, get the best of me. But as the days went on, the sightings became more frequent. She was everywhere, in the yard, by the road, even in the reflection of my windows. It was like she was trying to drive me mad, to make me question my own sanity. And maybe she was succeeding. I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. I was losing sleep, losing focus. The forest, which had once been my sanctuary, now felt like a trap. I started thinking about what she wanted, why she was haunting me. There had to be a reason, something I was missing. I needed answers, but I had no idea where to start looking. Then, one night, as I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized something. If she was tied to the forest, if that's where this all began, then maybe that's where I'd find my answers. I had to go back, to face whatever was out there, and find out the truth. It was the only way to make this stop, the only way to get my life back. The decision to go back into the forest wasn't easy, but I knew I had no other choice. The sightings had become more intense, more frequent. She wasn't just appearing at the edge of the woods anymore. She was closer, almost within reach. Every time I saw her, I felt this pull, like she was trying to lead me somewhere. I had to follow that feeling, no matter how much it scared me. I spent the next day preparing. I packed a small bag with essentials: flashlight, water, and a map of the area. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I had a gut feeling that the answers were out there, buried somewhere deep in those woods. By the time the sun started to set, I was ready. I couldn't wait any longer. I had to do this at night, when she was most active, when the forest felt the most alive. As I made my way into the trees, the familiar sounds of the forest surrounded me, but they felt different this time, more ominous, like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I followed the trail I'd taken 1,000 times before, but tonight it felt like I was venturing into unknown territory. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made me jump, my nerves on edge. After what felt like hours of walking, I reached the clearing where I'd first seen her. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. I stood there, waiting, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. And then, just like before, she appeared. But this time, she was different. She wasn't just standing there. She was moving, slowly, deliberately, toward a spot deeper in the woods. I followed her, my heart pounding in my chest. She led me to a part of the forest I'd never been to before, a place hidden away from the main trails, overgrown and forgotten. There, in the middle of the clearing, was an old, gnarled tree, its roots twisting and turning into the earth like fingers gripping the ground. I felt a chill run down my spine as I approached it. I don't know what made me do it, but I started digging at the base of the tree, using my hands to claw away the dirt. It wasn't long before I uncovered something, a small, rotting wooden box. My stomach turned as I pried it open, revealing what was inside: a handful of decayed, faded items, a child's shoe, a piece of fabric, and a locket with a tiny old photo inside. The picture was of a little girl, the same girl who had been haunting me. My hands shook as I held the locket, the reality of what I'd found sinking in. This was her, the girl who had been lost all those years ago. I'd heard stories, rumors about a missing child, but I'd never given them much thought. Now, standing in that clearing, it all made sense. She wasn't just a ghost. She was a restless spirit tied to this place, to the secrets buried under that tree. And somehow, I had been the one she'd chosen to find her. Holding that locket, I felt a wave of sorrow wash over me. This girl, this lost soul, had been waiting here all these years, trapped in the place where her life had ended. And somehow, she'd reached out to me, pulled me into her story. I stood there, the weight of what I'd discovered pressing down on me, and for a moment, I didn't know what to do. I knew I had to help her, to bring her some kind of peace. But how? I wasn't a priest or a psychic or anything like that. I was just a forest ranger, a guy who'd stumbled onto something far beyond his understanding. But as I looked around at the lonely clearing and the twisted roots of that ancient tree, I realized that this place had been her prison, and I had the power to set her free. I knelt down, still clutching the locket, and said a few words. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I just felt like I needed to acknowledge her, to let her know she wasn't forgotten. I promised her I would make sure people knew what happened to her, that I would bring her story to light. As I spoke, I felt a strange calm come over me, like the forest itself was listening. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the feeling of being watched disappeared. The air felt lighter, the shadows less threatening. I looked around, half expecting to see her standing there, but she was gone. Not just from my sight, but from the oppressive feeling that had been haunting me for weeks. I knew, in that moment, that she had moved on, that I had done what I was meant to do. I buried the box again, carefully covering it with dirt, and marked the spot in my mind. It wasn't much, but it felt right, like I was closing a chapter that had been left unfinished for too long. I stood up, brushed the dirt off my hands, and started back toward my truck. The walk felt different this time, less daunting, more like I was finally leaving something behind. The next morning, I went straight to the local authorities. I told them what I'd found, showed them the spot in the forest. They conducted an investigation, but I didn't stick around for the details. I'd done my part. I handed in my resignation a few days later. The forest, once my refuge, had become a place I couldn't bear to be anymore. As I packed up my things and prepared to leave, I couldn't help but think about that girl. Wherever she was now, I hoped she had found peace. And as for me, I was ready to move on too. It was supposed to be just another day. I kissed Sarah goodbye that morning, like I always did, and watched her drive off to work. I had no idea it would be the last time I'd see her. When she didn't come home that night, I tried to stay calm. I told myself she was probably caught up in some work out in the forest, that she'd be back soon. But as the hours dragged on, my worry grew. I called her phone over and over, but it went straight to voicemail. By midnight, I was pacing the living room, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that this wasn't just a routine delay. I knew Sarah, knew how careful and responsible she was. If she wasn't answering, there had to be a reason. The next morning, I reported her missing. The authorities launched a search, combing through the forest where she'd been working. I tried to stay hopeful, but with each passing day, that hope faded. They found her truck parked near one of the trails, keys still in the ignition, but no sign of her. It was like she'd vanished into thin air. I couldn't just sit around and wait. I had to do something, anything, to find her. The police did their best, but they were stretched thin, and as the days turned into weeks, it was clear they were losing hope. I wasn't ready to give up, not yet. I started going through her things, looking for clues, anything that might point to where she went or why she disappeared. That's when I found her journal, tucked away in the drawer of her nightstand. I hadn't even known she kept one. As I flipped through the pages, I saw that she'd been writing about strange things happening in the forest. Unexplained sounds, eerie feelings of being watched. She mentioned talking to some of the local indigenous people, how they seemed uneasy, like they knew something they weren't telling her. My heart pounded as I read her last entry, dated the day she went missing. It was short, just a few lines about needing to check something out, something she'd found deeper in the woods. I knew then that I had to go out there myself. I couldn't rely on anyone else to find her. This was something I had to do alone. I didn't waste any time. The next morning, I packed a bag with some basics: water, a flashlight, and a map of the area. I'd been out in those woods before, but never with this kind of weight on my shoulders. It felt like every step I took was one closer to some dark truth I wasn't sure I wanted to face. But I couldn't back down. Not when Sarah's life could be on the line. The trail where they found her truck was quiet, almost too quiet. I kept thinking about what Sarah had written in her journal, about the strange things she'd been noticing. The further I went, the more I felt like I was being watched. It wasn't just paranoia, there was something off about the whole place. The trees seemed thicker, the light dimmer, and there was this heavy, unsettling silence that wrapped around me like a blanket. I started with the area where her truck was found, combing through the underbrush, looking for any sign that she had been there. I found nothing, not a single clue. It was like she had just walked off the trail and disappeared into the forest. The more I searched, the more frustrated I became. It was as if the forest was swallowing up any trace of her, hiding her from me on purpose. As the day wore on, I ventured deeper into the woods, following what I hoped was the path Sarah had taken. I came across some old campsites, long abandoned, but nothing that looked like it had been used recently. I tried to think like her, to figure out where she might have gone, what she might have been looking for. But the deeper I went, the more I started to doubt myself. What if I was on the wrong path? What if I was too late? By the time the sun started to set, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I knew I had to turn back, but something kept pushing me forward. It was like an invisible hand was guiding me, pulling me deeper into the woods. I kept thinking about the last entry in her journal, how she mentioned something she needed to check out. What had she found out here that was so important? And why hadn't she told anyone about it? I didn't have any answers, just more questions and a growing sense of dread. As darkness fell, I set up camp for the night, determined to start again at first light. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind was racing, playing out every possible scenario. All I knew was that I wasn't leaving until I found Sarah, no matter what it took. Morning came, but it didn't bring any relief. I packed up quickly and got back on the trail, trying to stay focused. The forest was different in daylight, less oppressive, but still oddly quiet. I tried to follow the same path Sarah might have taken, scanning the ground for any sign of her. Around midday, I found something unusual. A series of symbols carved into the trees. They were intricate, almost like a code or a language I didn't recognize. My heart skipped a beat. Sarah's journal had mentioned strange symbols, but I didn't think I'd actually find any. I took pictures, hoping they might offer some clue or at least a lead. As I continued, I ran into a few locals who were out in the forest for their own reasons. They eyed me with suspicion, their faces closing up when I mentioned Sarah's disappearance. I could tell they knew something but weren't willing to share. One elderly woman in particular seemed to have an uneasy look in her eyes when I brought up Sarah. She muttered something about respecting the forest and walked away, leaving me with a chill. I decided to follow the path Sarah had described in her journal, hoping it would lead me to whatever she had been investigating. The deeper I went, the more I noticed subtle changes. The air felt colder, and the light seemed to shift in strange ways. It was like the forest was actively trying to keep me out. The sense of being watched grew stronger, and I began to feel a gnawing anxiety in the pit of my stomach. At one point, I came across a small, abandoned cabin hidden among the trees. It was old and weathered, but it looked recently disturbed. Inside, I found some personal items: clothing, a few tools, and a stack of old papers. None of it belonged to Sarah, but it was clear someone had been using the cabin. I couldn't shake the feeling that this place might be connected to her disappearance. That evening, as I made my way back to camp, I realized how isolated I was. The warnings from the locals and the eerie signs in the forest were starting to make sense. I was pushing deeper into something I didn't fully understand, and I felt a growing sense of dread. I knew I had to be cautious and smart about how I proceeded. I wasn't just looking for Sarah anymore. I was uncovering a mystery that seemed to involve forces beyond my control. As the days passed, the forest seemed to tighten around me. I felt like I was walking a thin line between sanity and madness. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deliberately keeping me from finding Sarah. Every lead seemed to dry up, and the deeper I dug, the more I felt like I was getting nowhere. One afternoon, I returned to the cabin. I needed to check it again, hoping I had missed something. Inside, I discovered an old journal tucked away under a loose floorboard. The journal wasn't in the best shape, but I could make out a few entries. They spoke of rituals and ancient practices, things that made little sense to me but hinted at a hidden world within the forest. I spent the next few hours researching these rituals and their meanings. The more I learned, the more I understood that the forest was not just a place but a living entity with its own rules and guardians. According to the journal, the local indigenous people had their own way of protecting the forest, and it involved more than just respecting nature. It seemed like Sarah had stumbled into something that was supposed to remain secret. That night, I heard a rustling outside my camp. It wasn't just the wind, it felt deliberate, like someone or something was moving around just out of sight. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, but there was nothing there. The feeling of being watched was almost suffocating, and I couldn't shake the idea that I was being drawn into something I didn't fully understand. The next morning, I set out to follow a new lead I had found in the journal. It described a secluded area where certain rituals were performed. I hoped that finding this place might offer some clues about Sarah's whereabouts. The path was treacherous, and the forest seemed to become denser and more oppressive the further I went. The trees seemed to close in on me, making it hard to see where I was going. Eventually, I reached a small clearing. At its center was an ancient stone structure covered in moss and vines. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. As I approached, I noticed more symbols carved into the stones, the same kind I had seen before. I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was clear that this place was significant, but I couldn't yet piece together why. I knew I was getting closer to uncovering the truth, but with each step, the danger felt more immediate, and the forest seemed to be tightening its grip on me. Standing in that ancient clearing, I felt a mix of dread and anticipation. The stone structure seemed to pulse with a strange energy, and the symbols carved into it felt like they were whispering secrets I wasn't supposed to hear. I knew I was on the verge of discovering something important, but what exactly, I wasn't sure. I took a deep breath and began to examine the structure closely. The more I looked, the more I saw patterns in the carvings. They matched some of the symbols I had seen before, but there were also new ones, more elaborate and detailed. It was like a story written in stone, but one that I couldn't fully decipher. As I touched one of the symbols, I felt a cold jolt through my body, as if the stone itself was reacting to my presence. My heart raced as I stepped back, suddenly aware of a presence behind me. I turned around to see a figure emerging from the shadows, one of the local indigenous people. He looked solemn and serious, his face painted with traditional markings. He didn't say a word, just stood there watching me with a piercing gaze. I could tell he knew something I needed to hear. He finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You've come too far," he said. "The forest protects its own. The rituals you've seen are meant to keep balance and peace. Your wife stumbled upon something she shouldn't have. The secrets you're uncovering are dangerous." I tried to explain that I was just looking for Sarah, that I needed to understand what happened to her. He listened, but remained stern. "Some things are not meant to be uncovered," he said. "There are forces at work here that are beyond your control. Your wife's disappearance was not an accident. It was a consequence of crossing boundaries that should never be crossed. His words hit me hard. It wasn't just about finding Sarah anymore. It was about understanding a hidden world that was far more complex and dangerous than I had imagined. I asked him if there was any way to find her, to make things right. He looked at me with a mix of pity and resignation. "The forest will reveal its secrets in time," he said. "But sometimes the truth is too much for us to bear." With that, he turned and disappeared back into the forest. I was left standing there, feeling more lost than ever. I knew I had to make a choice. Either I could continue to dig deeper, risking everything, or I could step back and accept that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on me, but one thing was clear. I couldn't keep pushing into the darkness without understanding the full cost of what I was doing. My boyfriend and I decided to go camping in eastern Pennsylvania. It was 2016, and we wanted to get away from everything. No phones, no distractions. We found this primitive campsite, deep in the woods. It was free to use, no cell service, and barely any road leading to it. Just the kind of place we were looking for. As we were driving there, we saw this woman on the side of the road. Her truck was parked with the hood open, like she was having car trouble. My boyfriend is usually the type to stop and help anyone, but this time he didn't. He just kept driving, saying something felt off about her. He said she didn't look like she needed help. She wasn't waving anyone down or anything, just standing there, waiting. It was strange, but I didn't think much of it. When we finally reached the campsite, we were alone, or so we thought. As we started setting up, I noticed a car passing by a couple of times. Each time, the same man was driving, and each time, he seemed to slow down and watch us. My boyfriend noticed it too, and mentioned how weird it was. But it was late, the weather was bad, and we had already set up, so we decided to stay. We figured maybe he was just trying to find a dry spot to camp like we were. We got a fire going and tried to relax. We roasted some hot dogs and talked, but I could tell my boyfriend was still on edge. He kept glancing around, like he was expecting someone to show up. The guy in the car never came back though, so after a while, we started to feel a little more comfortable. When it got dark, we crawled into our tent, ready to sleep. But as I lay there, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. The woods were too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every little noise stand out. I kept replaying the events of the day in my head. The woman with the truck, the man in the car. Something just didn't sit right with me. Despite my unease, I eventually drifted off to sleep, hoping the night would pass without incident. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, this growing sense of dread that wouldn't let go. I just didn't realize how much worse it was going to get. I don't know what time it was when I first heard the noise, but it jolted me awake. It was loud, sharp, and completely out of place. My first thought was that it might be some kind of animal, but then it came again, louder this time. My boyfriend was already sitting up, peering out through the small window of our tent. I could see his silhouette, tense, trying to figure out what was going on. The sound wasn't something I could easily describe. It reminded me of metal scraping against gravel, but there was something off about it, almost mechanical. My boyfriend whispered that it sounded like a machine gun revving up, which made my blood run cold. We were miles from anywhere, in the middle of the woods. Why would we hear something like that out here? He kept looking outside, but all he could see was darkness. The sound came again, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't dare move or speak. I just lay there, listening, every nerve on edge. My boyfriend finally pulled away from the window and whispered that it was probably far away, maybe from a construction site or something, and that I should try to get some sleep. But I could tell from the way he said it that he didn't believe it himself. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that it couldn't be anything dangerous, but the sound was so unnatural, so out of place, that it was impossible to ignore. I lay there, wide awake, straining to hear every little noise outside. Every rustle, every creak of the trees made me jump. It felt like something was out there, just beyond the tent, waiting. The worst part was that I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching us. It wasn't just the noise, it was the whole atmosphere. The quiet had become oppressive, suffocating. My mind kept racing back to the woman with the truck, the man in the car. Were they connected to this somehow? Or was it just a coincidence? I kept trying to rationalize it, but the fear was too strong. I could feel it tightening around me, making it hard to breathe. My boyfriend was lying beside me, but I could tell he wasn't sleeping either. We were both just waiting, hoping that whatever was making that noise would go away and leave us alone. But deep down, I knew this night wasn't going to end well. I must have fallen asleep at some point, but it didn't last long. I woke up to my boyfriend shaking me, his voice low and urgent. He told me to get dressed quickly, that we were leaving. I could see the worry in his eyes, which made the fear that had been gnawing at me all night come rushing back. I didn't ask questions. I just started grabbing my things, my hands shaking as I tried to move quietly. He was already out of the tent, standing guard with the facão we'd brought for clearing brush. Seeing him like that, holding it like he was ready for anything, made my stomach twist. He'd unwrapped it from its plastic covering, something we hadn't bothered there to do before. I knew then that whatever had spooked him wasn't just in my head. He felt it too, and it was bad enough that he wasn't taking any chances. I stepped out of the tent and into the cool night air, which seemed to cling to my skin. My eyes darted around, looking for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the dark shapes of the trees and the faint glow of the dying fire. My boyfriend was already packing up the rest of our gear, his movements quick but careful, like he was trying not to draw attention. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something or someone was out there, hidden in the shadows. As we loaded up the car, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. Near the fire pit, where we'd been cooking earlier, was a beer can. It hadn't been there before. We hadn't brought any beer, and we were the only ones around. At least, that's what we thought. I pointed it out to my boyfriend, who went pale when he saw it. He just nodded, his jaw set, and told me to get in the car. There was no more time for questions or second guessing. We got in, and my boyfriend started the car, his eyes scanning the area one last time before he hit the gas. As we drove away, the tension in the car was thick, almost suffocating. Neither of us spoke for a while. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see something chasing us down the road, but there was nothing, just the dark, empty woods behind us. When we were finally a safe distance away, my boyfriend explained why he'd suddenly decided to leave. He said that after the last strange noise, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was trying to lure us out of the tent, that maybe they were waiting for us to make a move. He didn't want to take any chances, so he decided it was better to pack up and get out of there before something happened. It wasn't just the noise that had him on edge. It was everything. The woman on the road, the man in the car, the beer can. It all added up to something bad, something we couldn't explain. The drive felt like it stretched on forever, the darkness swallowing up the road ahead. My boyfriend's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his eyes locked straight ahead. I could tell he was still on high alert, every muscle in his body tense. I didn't dare say anything. I was too busy scanning the road behind us, half expecting to see headlights or shadows moving in the trees. After what felt like hours, we finally hit a paved road. The smooth hum of the tires was a relief, but it didn't ease the knot of fear still twisting in my gut. We hadn't seen a single car since we left the campsite, and that emptiness made everything feel more sinister. The silence between us grew heavier, filled with everything we weren't saying. I could tell he was still processing it all, just like I was, trying to make sense of the unease that had driven us away. Eventually, we pulled into a small gas station, the bright lights a stark contrast to the shadows we'd just escaped. My boyfriend got out to fill up the tank, and I watched him from inside the car, my heart still racing. As I looked around, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched, that whatever had been out there might have followed us. It was irrational, I knew, but the fear was too real to ignore. When he got back in the car, he handed me a bottle of water and told me we'd find a motel for the night. There was no way we were going back to another campsite, not after what happened. I nodded, too exhausted to argue. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me drained and jittery. All I wanted was to be somewhere with 4 solid walls and a locked door between us and the outside world. We drove in silence again, but this time it was different. The immediate danger felt like it was behind us, but the fear hadn't gone away. It was still there, gnawing at the edges of my mind, making me question everything that had happened. I kept thinking about the beer can, the woman, the man in the car. None of it made sense, but all of it felt connected, like pieces of a puzzle we couldn't quite put together. When we finally found a motel, we checked in without saying much to each other. The room was small and a little rundown, but it felt safe. As soon as we locked the door, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, though it didn't last long. My boyfriend sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, deep in thought. I knew he was still on edge, still trying to figure out what the hell had happened back there. And honestly, so was I. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt, like we'd narrowly escaped something that we'd never really understand. That night in the motel, I barely slept. Every sound outside the door made me jump, my mind racing with thoughts of what could have happened if we hadn't left. My boyfriend was quiet, but I knew he was just as rattled as I was. Neither of us wanted to admit how scared we were, but it hung in the air between us, heavy and unspoken. Around 3 a.m., I finally drifted off, only to be jolted awake by a loud noise outside. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, straining to hear. It was just a car pulling into the parking lot, but it took a while for my pulse to settle down. I could see my boyfriend was awake too, his eyes wide open in the dark. He didn't say anything, just reached over and took my hand, holding it tightly. When morning finally came, the first rays of light creeping through the curtains, I felt a small sense of relief. We had made it through the night, and the daylight brought a sliver of safety. We packed up quickly, eager to get on the road and put as much distance as possible between us and the campsite. As we loaded the car, I kept glancing around, half expecting to see something or someone watching us. But there was nothing, just the normal sounds of a new day. The drive home was quiet. We didn't talk much, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The further we got from the woods, the easier it became to convince myself that maybe it hadn't been as bad as it seemed. Maybe we had overreacted. But then I would remember the beer can, the strange noises, and the way my boyfriend had insisted on leaving in the middle of the night. It didn't feel like overreacting then. It felt like survival. When we finally reached home, the familiar sights of our neighborhood brought a wave of comfort. We unpacked the car in silence, the tension slowly beginning to ease. But even as we settled back into our routine, the memory of that night lingered. It became a story we told ourselves, a reminder that not everything out there can be explained. Looking back, I'm still not sure what exactly happened in those woods, whether it was just our imaginations running wild or if something more sinister was at play. I'll never know. But I do know this: we were right to trust our instincts, to leave when something didn't feel right. Sometimes, the only way to stay safe is to listen to that voice in your head, the one that tells you to get the hell out before it's too late. I've been a forest ranger in Montana for as long as I can remember, starting back in 1982. The job suits me. The air here is crisp, the kind that clears your head after a long week. Most days, it's quiet, just the wind through the trees and the occasional chatter of animals. My job isn't complicated: keep the forest safe and make sure everyone comes out of it the same way they went in. I've always been good at that. I've seen a lot during my time on the job. Lost hikers, the occasional bear encounter, kids getting themselves into trouble. But 1992 was different. It was the kind of year that sticks with you. One afternoon, we got word that a group of campers hadn't checked in. It wasn't unusual for people to lose track of time out here, but something about this call made my gut tighten. I grabbed my gear and met up with my partner. We'd worked together for years, so there wasn't much we needed to say. We both knew the routine. We set out on the trail where the campers were last seen. The sun was just starting to dip below the trees, casting long shadows. I kept my eyes on the ground, looking for any sign of where they might have gone. As we hiked deeper, the usual forest sounds seemed to fade. It was like the woods were holding their breath. We called out their names a few times, but there was no answer. After about an hour, we found their campsite. The fire pit was cold, and their tents were still up, but something wasn't right. It felt off, like they'd left in a hurry. That's when we noticed the first drop of blood. It was small, barely noticeable in the dirt, but it was enough to set off alarms in my head. We started finding more, tiny smears on the leaves, a torn piece of fabric snagged on a branch. I've seen blood before, but never like this. It was leading us somewhere, almost like a trail. I didn't say anything to my partner, but I could see he was thinking the same thing. Whatever happened to those campers, it wasn't good. And I had a feeling we were about to find out just how bad it really was. We kept moving, following that grim trail. My heartbeat drummed in my ears, louder with every step. The deeper we went, the heavier the air seemed to get, like the forest itself was closing in around us. I could tell my partner felt it too. His usual calm had given way to something more tense, more alert. We didn't talk much, just kept our eyes on the path ahead. Then, we found the first real sign that something was horribly wrong. It was a shoe, half buried in the dirt, with blood smeared across the laces. The sight of it made my stomach churn. This wasn't just a simple accident. Whatever happened here was violent, brutal. I bent down, picking it up, hoping it might give us a clue. It was small, like it belonged to a woman or maybe a teenager. That made it worse somehow, knowing they probably never stood a chance. My partner muttered something under his breath, but I didn't catch it. I was too focused on the growing sense of dread crawling up my spine. We pressed on, and the blood trail became more pronounced, thicker, like whatever or whoever was bleeding had been dragged. I felt like we were being watched, like something was out there, hidden between the trees, waiting for the right moment. But I couldn't see anything, just shadows playing tricks on my mind. We eventually reached a clearing. At first glance, it looked peaceful, almost untouched, but as we stepped into it, the scene that unfolded before us made my blood run cold. There were more clothes scattered around, ripped and stained. Pieces of gear were tossed about, broken like they'd been left in a hurry. And there, in the middle, a large pool of blood, dark and sticky, soaking into the ground. I'd never seen anything like it before. My partner and I exchanged a glance, both of us realizing this wasn't just a search and rescue anymore. We were walking into something far worse, something neither of us was prepared for. But turning back wasn't an option. We had to find out what happened here, no matter how much we wished we didn't. Standing in that clearing, I felt the weight of what we'd stumbled into. The silence around us was thick, like the whole forest was holding its breath. My partner and I knew we were out of our depth, but we couldn't just walk away. We had a duty, even if we were terrified of what we might find next. We started searching the area, hoping to find some clue, some sign of what had happened. I moved towards the edge of the clearing, where the trees formed a dense wall of shadows. That's when I noticed something half buried under a pile of leaves. I crouched down, brushing them aside, and my heart nearly stopped. It was a hand, cold, pale, and lifeless. I called my partner over, and we both just stared for a moment, trying to process it. We started digging, uncovering more of the body. It was one of the campers, a young man, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. There were deep gashes across his chest and arms, like he'd been attacked by something with claws. I'd seen animal attacks before, but this was different. It wasn't just the wounds, it was the way he'd been left, almost like he'd been posed. We kept looking, dreading what else we might find. It didn't take long to discover more bodies, each one more disturbing than the last. They were scattered around the clearing, hidden among the trees, as if whatever did this had been toying with them. Each face told the same story: fear, pain, and a struggle that ended in horror. My partner was shaking, his usual tough exterior cracking under the pressure. I could feel it too, the overwhelming sense that we were in way over our heads. This wasn't something natural, something we could explain. It felt wrong, like the forest itself had turned against us. I tried to focus, tried to think of what to do next. We couldn't stay here. That much was clear. But leaving meant heading back through the same woods where this had happened, and the thought of that filled me with dread. Still, we had no choice. We had to report what we'd found, even if I wasn't sure anyone would believe us. We started heading back, but every step felt heavier than the last. The forest that had once been familiar now felt hostile, like it was watching us, waiting. I kept my hand close to my sidearm, though deep down, I knew it wouldn't do much good against whatever was out there. My partner was ahead of me, moving faster than he should have. I could tell he just wanted to get out of there, and honestly, I couldn't blame him. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was following us. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. We'd only gone a short distance when we heard it, a rustling, like something moving quickly through the underbrush. My partner froze, and so did I. We stood there, listening, trying to pinpoint the sound. It was coming from the direction we'd just come from, and it was getting closer. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, the adrenaline kicking in hard. Then, just as quickly as it started, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, more unsettling than the sound itself. My partner turned to me, his face pale, and whispered that we needed to move faster. I didn't argue. We picked up the pace, almost breaking into a jog, trying to put as much distance as we could between us and whatever was out there. But the forest wasn't letting us go that easily. The path we'd taken earlier seemed different now, twisted, like the trees had shifted when we weren't looking. It didn't make sense, but nothing about this day did. We kept moving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being herded, pushed in a direction we didn't want to go. The fear was nearly overwhelming, but we didn't stop. We couldn't. We needed to get out, to make it back to safety, to tell someone, anyone, what had happened. But deep down, I knew that whatever was out there wasn't going to let us leave that easily. And with every step we took, the forest seemed to close in tighter around us. We were almost running now, the trees blurring past as we pushed forward. My lungs burned with every breath, but I couldn't slow down. The feeling of being watched had only grown stronger, like something was right behind us, just out of sight. My partner was a few steps ahead, glancing back every so often, his eyes wide with fear. I could see the panic setting in, both in him and in myself. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow looked like it was moving. We weren't just lost. We were being hunted. It was a terrifying realization, and it took everything in me to keep going, to not give in to the urge to scream or run blindly into the woods. Then, without warning, my partner tripped. He went down hard, hitting the ground with a thud. I skidded to a stop, reaching out to help him up. But before I could grab his arm, something pulled him back. Something I couldn't see, but I could feel. His eyes locked on mine, filled with a terror I'll never forget, and he was yanked into the darkness before I could do anything to stop it. I froze, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. 1 second he was there, and the next he was gone, swallowed by the shadows. The silence that followed was crushing, almost suffocating. I stood there, stunned, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of lead, rooted to the spot where my partner had disappeared. Then I heard it, a whisper, soft and eerie, coming from the direction where he'd been pulled. It didn't sound human, more like a hiss, like something mimicking speech without understanding it. It sent a chill down my spine, breaking me out of my stupor. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the spot where he'd been taken, afraid that if I turned my back, whatever was out there would come for me next. I forced myself to move, to turn and run. My thoughts were a mess, fear clouding everything, but one thing was clear. I had to get out of there. My partner was gone, taken by something I couldn't explain, and if I didn't leave now, I knew I'd be next. So I ran, faster than I ever had in my life, not stopping until the trees started to thin and the edge of the forest came into view. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in those woods was still watching, waiting for its next chance to strike. I've been working in the Forest Service for years, and I've seen my fair share of strange things out here, but nothing could have prepared me for that day in Montana. It started out like any other. I loaded up my gear, saddled my horse, and set out to do some routine tests on the streams. The ride was long, but I'd grown used to the solitude. It's part of the job, Just you, the land, and whatever else is out there. I was about halfway to the stream when I first heard it. A voice, distant but clear, calling my name. I pulled up my horse and listened, thinking maybe someone else was out there. But I couldn't see anyone. Just the endless expanse of trees and the mountains in the distance. It felt odd, but I figured it must have been the wind carrying a sound from somewhere else. I shook it off and continued. The closer I got to the stream, the louder the voice became. It wasn't frantic or panicked, just steady, like someone was trying to get my attention. I looked around, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of life. Just that voice, calling out to me. I've spent enough time in the wilderness to know when something's off, and this was definitely off. But I wasn't about to let some strange noise spook me. I had a job to do. By the time I reached the stream, the voice was almost deafening. It was like it was coming from right next to me, but there was still no one in sight. I dismounted, trying to focus on my work, but the voice kept at it, relentless. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the sweat starting to bead on my forehead, despite the cool air. Whatever this was, it wasn't normal, and I knew I had to be on high alert. As I bent down to start my tests, something caught my eye. There, just beneath the surface of the water, was a fragment of bone. I've seen animal remains out here before, but this was different. This was human. I pulled it out, and sure enough, it was a piece of a skull, worn smooth by the elements. I've never had anything like this happen to me before, and I didn't know what to make of it. That's when the voice stopped. Just like that, it was gone. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise. I stood there for a long moment, holding that skull, trying to make sense of what just happened. Something wasn't right, and every instinct I had was telling me to leave. So I wrapped up the skull, packed my gear, and headed back, trying to shake the feeling that someone or something had been watching me the whole time. When I got back to the base, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I handed over the skull fragment to the authorities, trying to keep my composure. They took it for analysis, promising me they'd look into it. All I wanted was to forget the whole thing, but that was easier said than done. The voice, the skull, it all kept replaying in my mind. For the next few days, I found it hard to concentrate on anything. The voice was still fresh in my memory, and every little sound seemed to trigger that unsettling feeling again. I kept expecting someone to come knocking on my door with news about the skull, but no one came. The days dragged on, and I started to think maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Then, one morning, I received a call from the authorities. They wanted me to come in and discuss the results of the analysis. My heart sank as I made my way to their office, dreading what I was about to hear. I tried to prepare myself for any news, but nothing could have prepared me for what they told me. The skull belonged to a man who had been a notorious serial killer. He disappeared into the wilderness in 1983 and had never been found. The authorities had been searching for him for years, but he had vanished without a trace. They'd thought he'd made his escape and somehow slipped away, but here I was, holding a piece of his remains. They explained that the DNA on the skull matched the killer's, confirming his identity. The realization hit me hard. The voice I'd heard calling my name was connected to him somehow. Maybe he had been trying to lure me to his final resting place, or perhaps he was still out there, somehow aware that his remains had been found. Either way, it was a chilling thought. The whole experience left me deeply unsettled. I kept wondering if there was more to the story that I didn't understand. The forest, once a place of peace and solitude, now felt tainted by what I had discovered. I continued my work, but every rustle of leaves and every distant sound made me uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had become a place where something dark and lingering was always watching. The weeks after discovering the skull were unnerving. I threw myself into my work, hoping to push away the lingering fear. But every time I rode out to test the streams, the memory of that day haunted me. I couldn't help but feel that I was being watched, that the forest was somehow different. It wasn't just the isolation, it was as if the land itself was holding its breath. One day, while on my usual route, I noticed something strange. A weathered sign had appeared near the spot where I'd found the skull. It was barely legible, but it seemed to warn of dangerous conditions. I'd ridden this path countless times, and I was sure there had been no sign before. I stopped to inspect it, feeling a chill run down my spine. It was as if someone had put it there just for me. As I continued, I noticed more signs. Rusty metal stakes driven into the ground with cryptic markings. They seemed out of place, adding to the growing sense of dread. I started taking a different route, avoiding the area where I'd found the skull. But the feeling of being followed never left me. It was like the forest was closing in, becoming a maze of shadows and whispers. I tried to brush it off as paranoia, but my colleagues noticed my change in demeanor. They asked if everything was all right, but I just brushed it off. I didn't want to worry them with the strange occurrences or the unsettling feeling that had settled over me. The more I kept to myself, the more I felt like I was drifting away from reality. Then one evening, I received a call from the authorities. They wanted to talk to me about some additional findings related to the skull. Apparently, they had traced some old reports and discovered that the serial killer had been linked to a network of abandoned cabins in the area. They suspected that he might have had a hideout or even a base of operations there. I was both relieved and terrified. The idea that there might be more to find filled me with dread. I agreed to help with the investigation, hoping to finally get some answers. As I prepared for the search, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was left out there, whatever had drawn me into this nightmare, was still very much alive. For the next few weeks, I was on edge every time I had to go out into the field. Each trip felt like stepping into a different world, one where the lines between reality and something darker seemed to blur. I tried to stay focused on my work, but the memory of the skull and that eerie voice haunted me. One morning, I was out checking a different stream, still feeling uneasy. The forest seemed unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. As I was finishing up, I noticed something strange. The ground near the water looked disturbed, like someone had been digging or moving the earth around. I took a closer look, but there was nothing definitive, just a feeling that something was amiss. I couldn't shake the thought that the disturbed ground might be related to the skull I'd found. Was there more to discover? Or was it just my mind playing tricks on me? I decided to report it, but the authorities seemed more interested in my well-being than the disturbed ground. They assured me they'd send a team to investigate, but I never heard back about what they found. The unsettling feeling only grew stronger as time went on. Every shadow seemed to hide something. Every whisper of wind felt like a message from the past. I tried to talk to colleagues about it, but they dismissed my concerns. They said it was normal to feel this way after such an intense discovery, but it didn't make it any easier. Then, one evening, as I was leaving the base, I heard that voice again. It was faint but unmistakable, like a distant call carried on the wind. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. The voice seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, and it left me feeling exposed and vulnerable. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the disturbed ground and the voice. What if there were more remains? What if the killer's presence was still lingering in the forest, waiting for someone to uncover more of his secrets? I knew I had to keep working, but every step felt like a step closer to something I couldn't fully understand or escape. One day, I was out checking on a new site. The voice had become a regular part of my fieldwork, but it was always faint and distant, almost like a figment of my imagination. This time, though, it was different. As I was examining a riverbank, I heard the voice clearly, like someone was standing right next to me, whispering my name. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing, just trees and the river, as silent as ever. I tried to brush it off as stress or exhaustion, but deep down I knew something was wrong. The feeling that I was being watched grew stronger, and I couldn't shake the paranoia that came with it. A few days later, I received another call from the authorities. They wanted to talk to me about the findings from the disturbed ground I'd reported. I went to their office, hoping for some clarity. Instead, they handed me more information about the serial killer. Apparently, he had been involved in some unsolved cases that stretched across several states. The more they told me, the more it became clear that this was no ordinary case. The final straw came when I returned to the base after a routine check. I found a note on my desk. It was scrawled in a shaky hand and simply read, "You're getting close." There was no signature, no indication of who left it. It felt like a taunt, or worse, a threat. I had to confront the reality that the killer might have been active in the area far more recently than anyone thought. The note and the voice were just too connected to ignore. I didn't know what to do or who to trust. It felt like I was being pulled into a dangerous game I couldn't escape from. After that, I took every precaution. I made sure to always be aware of my surroundings and never went anywhere alone if I could help it. The forest had become a place of unease rather than tranquility. I kept working, but I couldn't help but feel that the presence of the killer, or whatever was left behind, was still lurking out there, waiting for its next chance to reveal itself. I've been a forest ranger in Montana for nearly 15 years now, and I've seen my fair share of strange things out here. But this story takes me back to a time about 3 years after I started the job, a time when I still thought I had seen it all. We began getting calls from campers about a lone wolf wandering near their sites. The weird part was, the callers all mentioned the same detail. The wolf was wearing a collar. That caught my attention right away, since wolves aren't supposed to be in this area, much less ones with collars. The reports kept coming in, and although the wolf wasn't acting aggressive, it was unsettling enough that I decided to head out and see for myself. I left the station around noon, driving to the spots where it had been sighted. The day was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you wonder if you're the only living thing for miles. I drove around for a few hours, stopping at different campsites, asking if anyone had seen the wolf recently. Each time I got the same answer. Yes, they saw it earlier, but it had wandered off. After a few hours without any new sightings, I decided to take a break. I parked the truck, grabbed a snack, and sat down on a fallen log. The air was still, and I could hear the faint sound of the creek nearby. I was just about to get moving again when I saw it, a large animal trotting near the tree line, about 20 feet away. My first thought was that it had to be the wolf everyone was talking about, but as I looked closer, something didn't add up. This animal was wearing a collar, just like they said, but it wasn't a wolf. It was too big, and the shape wasn't right. The fur was darker, almost jet black, and the build was more like a dog's, but not like any dog I'd ever seen before. I whistled, hoping to get a better look, and to my surprise, it came right over. Up close, it looked even stranger. It had the size and presence of a wolf, but its eyes were calm, almost like it was expecting me. I radioed the station, telling them I had found the animal and I'd be bringing it back. But the second I said that, the dog turned and bolted into the trees, like it knew what I was planning. I didn't have time to think. I just took off after it. The chase was on, and for a few minutes it felt like I was being led on some wild goose chase through the forest. The dog would slow down just enough for me to catch up, then dart ahead again, like it was playing a game. I'm not sure why I kept following it. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I just didn't want to lose it after coming this far. Either way, I was determined to catch up to it. We eventually reached a rocky area by a stream, and that's when the dog finally slowed down, pacing back and forth. Something felt off, like the chase had led me here for a reason, but I couldn't figure out what. Not yet, anyway. As I approached the spot where the dog had slowed down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just a simple chase. The dog was pacing near the stream, its eyes fixed on something hidden in the underbrush. I took a few cautious steps forward, trying to figure out what had caught its attention. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. The ground was covered in leaves and twigs, nothing out of the ordinary for the area. But then, as I looked closer, I noticed something white sticking out from beneath the leaves. My heart skipped a beat when I realized what it was: bones. They were almost completely hidden, but enough was exposed for me to know that I wasn't dealing with an animal's remains. These were human bones. I froze for a moment, not sure what to do next. The reality of what I had stumbled upon started to sink in. I immediately reached for my radio and called it in, trying to keep my voice steady as I described the scene. The dispatcher said they'd send a team out right away, and I was told to stay put until they arrived. While I waited, I couldn't stop staring at the bones. They were scattered, some half buried, others more exposed. It was clear they had been there for a long time, maybe even years. I tried to piece together what might have happened, but nothing made sense. How had these remains ended up here, in the middle of the forest, and why had the dog led me right to them? The dog, however, was nowhere to be seen. It had vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me alone with the unsettling discovery. I searched the area with my eyes, hoping to spot it again, but there was no sign of it. At that moment, I couldn't worry about the dog. I had to focus on what was in front of me. The wait for the recovery team felt like hours, though it was probably only about 30 minutes. When they finally arrived, I briefed them on what I had found. They quickly set to work, carefully gathering the remains while I stood off to the side, still trying to process everything. The dog, the bones, the eerie sense that something wasn't right, it all felt like a bad dream, one I couldn't wake up from. The days after the discovery were a blur of questions, reports, and interviews. The remains were identified as those of a teenage boy who had gone missing years before I even started working here. His name was Thomas, and the case had gone cold not long after his disappearance. There had been no leads, no clues, nothing to suggest where he might have gone, until now. The official report stated that Thomas had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The gun was found nearby, rusted and almost buried by time. It was a tragic end to a young life, one that had been lost and forgotten in these woods. But what I couldn't shake was the dog. There was no mention of it in the reports, and no one else seemed to know what I was talking about when I brought it up. It was like it had never existed. I started asking around, hoping someone else had seen the dog or knew something about it. The other rangers gave me strange looks, probably thinking I was losing it. But I couldn't let it go. How could a dog, wearing a collar, appear out of nowhere, lead me to a body, and then vanish without a trace? It didn't make sense, and the more I thought about it, the more it ate at me. I decided to do some digging on my own. I went through old files, looking for anything that might explain what I had seen. That's when I found a report about Thomas's disappearance. It mentioned that he had been deeply affected by the death of his best friend, a black Labrador. The dog had been hit by a car just a few weeks before Thomas went missing. His family had said he was never the same after that, sinking deeper into depression. It was then that I started to put the pieces together. The dog I had seen matched the description of Thomas's old pet, right down to the collar. It seemed impossible, but the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that the dog had somehow returned to lead me to Thomas. But how? And why now, after all these years? These questions kept me up at night. I knew I couldn't talk to anyone about it without sounding crazy, so I kept it to myself. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. The dog had been there, and it had shown me something I was meant to find. The forest holds many secrets, but this one felt personal, like it was meant just for me. A few days later, I got a call from Thomas's mother. She had been notified about the discovery, and she wanted to speak with the ranger who had found her son. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I agreed to talk. We arranged a time, and when the call came through, I could hear the strain in her voice, the weight of years spent waiting for answers. She thanked me for finding Thomas, and we talked for a while about how he had been before he disappeared. She mentioned his love for the outdoors, how he would spend hours hiking with his dog Max. As she spoke, I couldn't help but bring up the dog I had seen. I described it as best I could, even mentioning the collar. There was a long pause on her end, and for a moment, I thought the line had gone dead. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, softer, almost hesitant. She told me that Max had been Thomas's only real friend. After Max died, Thomas had become withdrawn, spending more and more time alone in the woods. The last time anyone saw Thomas, he had taken Max's collar with him. It was the only thing he had left to remember the dog by. Hearing that sent a chill through me. I had seen that collar, and I had seen that dog. There was no doubt in my mind now. I told her everything. The strange chase through the forest, how the dog had led me right to the bones, and how it had disappeared as soon as I got close. I could hear her trying to hold back tears as I spoke, and when I finished, she simply said, "Thank you." I wasn't sure what to say after that. I wanted to offer some kind of comfort, but what could I say that would make any of this easier to understand? We ended the call not long after, and I just sat there, staring at the phone, feeling more unsettled than ever. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the dog. The way it had looked at me, almost as if it knew me. It was as if it had been waiting all these years for someone to finally come along and find Thomas. But why me? And why now? The questions kept piling up, and the more I tried to find answers, the further away they seemed. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something I was missing, something important. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that dog, its dark fur, the way it had looked at me, almost like it was trying to tell me something. I started to go back to the spot where I found the bones, hoping for some kind of clue, but the forest was quiet. There were no signs of the dog, no new leads, just the same sense of unease that had been following me since that day. One evening, about a week after the call with Thomas's mother, I decided to visit the site one last time. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. I stood there, looking around, half expecting the dog to appear again, but the forest was still, almost too still. I crouched down near where the bones had been found, trying to imagine what Thomas must have felt in his final moments, alone and in so much pain. As I stood up to leave, I heard it, a soft rustling in the underbrush behind me. I turned, my heart pounding, and there it was. The dog, just as I remembered it, standing a few yards away. Its eyes met mine, and for a moment I felt a strange sense of calm, like everything was finally making sense. The dog didn't move toward me this time. It just watched, its tail wagging slowly, almost as if it was saying goodbye. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the dog turned and trotted off into the trees. I stood there, rooted to the spot, watching until it disappeared from view. I don't know how long I stayed there after that, but when I finally made my way back to the station, I felt different, like a weight had been lifted. I realized that the dog wasn't just leading me to Thomas, it was showing me the connection between them, the bond that had outlasted death. I never saw the dog again after that night, but I didn't need to. I knew it had fulfilled its purpose, guiding me to what needed to be found. The discovery brought closure, not just for Thomas's family, but for me too. It made me realize that the forest isn't just a place of danger and mystery, it's also a place where even the most lost souls can find peace. In the end, I came to understand that some things can't be explained, and maybe they don't need to be. I'll carry the memory of that dog with me for the rest of my life. A reminder that sometimes, in the most unexpected ways, we find exactly what we're meant to, even when we're not looking for it. Abigail and I had always worked well together. She knew the wildlife inside out, and I knew the terrain like the back of my hand. So when we were assigned to this joint project in Montana, it felt like any other job. We'd been sent out to collect some soil and vegetation samples for a study she was leading. Nothing out of the ordinary, at least that's what we thought. The drive out was peaceful. We chatted about everything but work, weekend plans, and upcoming family visit. We arrived at the site around midday. The area was quiet, just the usual sounds of the forest. Abigail got to work quickly, setting up her equipment while I kept an eye on the surroundings. My job was to ensure her safety and to assist with any heavy lifting. It was routine, something we'd done dozens of times before. About an hour into our work, I noticed something off. There was this eerie silence, like the forest was holding its breath. Then, just beyond the tree line, I saw it, a wolf. At first, I didn't think much of it. Wolves aren't uncommon out here, but this one was different. It stood perfectly still, just watching us, with an intensity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I nudged Abigail and pointed it out. She paused, glancing up from her work, and saw it too. There was something strange in its eyes, something that didn't feel right. We were both uneasy, but neither of us said anything. We just packed up quicker than usual, and I kept my eyes on that wolf the whole time. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stared at us with those piercing eyes. On the drive back, neither of us spoke about it. We both felt it, though, this gnawing sense that something wasn't right. Abigail tried to brush it off, saying it was probably just curious, maybe even sick, but I could tell she was just trying to make sense of it. Deep down, I think we both knew there was more to that encounter than we wanted to admit. That night, I couldn't shake the image of those eyes. They weren't the eyes of a typical wolf. They seemed almost human, filled with a cold, calculating awareness. I told myself I was overthinking it, that it was just an animal. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far more unsettling. The next couple of days were busy enough that I managed to push the wolf out of my mind. Abigail had some data to analyze, and I had routine patrols to keep me occupied. We didn't talk much about what had happened, and it seemed like maybe we'd just overreacted. That is, until the wolf showed up again. It was late afternoon, and I was finishing up some paperwork at the ranger station when I got a call from one of the other rangers. He sounded a bit confused, asking if we had any wolf sightings recently. I told him about the one Abigail and I had seen, but didn't think much of it until he mentioned the wolf was standing just outside the station, staring at the building. I stepped outside, and there it was, the same wolf, same intense gaze. It was just standing there, almost like it was waiting for something. The other rangers gave it a wide berth, not sure what to make of it. I approached slowly, keeping my distance. Heck, but the wolf didn't move. It just watched me, those eyes following every step I took. There was something deeply unnerving about the way it seemed to know me, like it had come here specifically for me. After a few minutes, the wolf turned and disappeared back into the woods. I didn't know what to make of it. Wolves don't behave like that, at least not the ones I've encountered. They're cautious. They keep their distance. This one, though, it seemed like it was trying to send a message, one I couldn't quite grasp. I went home that evening, unsettled. Abigail noticed right away that something was off, and when I told her about the wolf, she went quiet. We both knew it was the same one from the other day, but neither of us had an explanation. We tried to go about our evening as usual, but there was a tension in the air that neither of us could ignore. That night, sleep didn't come easy. I kept thinking about that wolf, the way it had looked at me, like it was waiting for me to figure something out. I got up a couple of times to check the windows, half expecting to see it standing outside in the dark. But there was nothing, just the quiet of the night and the creeping feeling that this was far from over. The next day, I felt on edge, like I was constantly being watched. Even at work, I couldn't shake the feeling that the wolf was out there, somewhere, waiting. Every time I looked out the window, I half expected to see it, those eyes locking onto mine again. I started to wonder if we had somehow crossed a line, if we had done something to attract this creature's attention. But what? And why? The questions gnawed at me, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the wolf made its next move. The following evening, I was home alone. Abigail had gone to a late meeting with some colleagues about her research, and I was trying to unwind, but my nerves were on edge. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see that wolf again, but everything seemed normal. I told myself I was being paranoid. Wolves don't stalk people, especially not like this. Just as I started to relax, I heard a noise outside, like something moving around. I froze, listening. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some other animal, but then I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on gravel. Slowly, I moved to the window and peeked out. My heart skipped a beat when I saw the wolf standing in our driveway, right near Abigail's car. It wasn't just standing there, though. It was pacing, like it was agitated or waiting for something. I watched it for a few minutes, trying to figure out what to do. Should I go out and scare it off? Call someone? But deep down, I knew this was no ordinary wolf. There was a purpose behind its actions, something beyond what I could understand. I decided to stay inside, not wanting to provoke it, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the window. I felt trapped, like that wolf was holding me hostage in my own home. It stayed there for what felt like hours, just pacing back and forth, occasionally stopping to look up at the house. I could see its eyes glowing in the dim light, and there was an intelligence in them that made my skin crawl. This wasn't just an animal. there was something more, something I couldn't explain but could feel in my bones. I could feel its gaze, even when it wasn't looking directly at me. It was like the wolf was inside my head, and I couldn't shake the sense that it knew exactly what it was doing. When Abigail finally got home, the wolf was gone. I didn't tell her what had happened right away. I wasn't sure how to explain it without sounding crazy. But I could tell she noticed something was wrong. She asked if I was okay, and I just nodded, trying to play it off like nothing was out of the ordinary. But I knew she could see through me. The unease I felt was written all over my face. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound made me jump, and I kept imagining the wolf lurking just outside the window, watching us, waiting. I started to question everything I knew about my job, about the animals I'd spent years studying and protecting. This wasn't normal, and I was beginning to feel like I was losing control. Whatever this wolf was, it wasn't going to stop. I could feel it. And the worst part was, I had no idea what it wanted or how to stop it. Over the next few days, the wolf's behavior escalated. It wasn't just appearing outside our workplace anymore. It started showing up at our house, standing silently in the shadows. Abigail and I would catch glimpses of it through the windows, its eyes reflecting the light from inside. Every time we went out, whether it was to grab groceries or to take a walk, the wolf was there, always at a distance but never out of sight. One night, after we returned from dinner, we saw the wolf standing at the edge of our driveway. I could feel Abigail's grip tighten on my arm as we got out of the car. The wolf just watched us from the darkness, its presence almost palpable. I tried to make light of it, saying it was probably just a curious animal, but I knew that wasn't true. The way it stared, the way it followed us, it was different. I decided to try and get a closer look. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, determined to confront it. As I approached, the wolf backed away slowly, keeping its eyes fixed on me. I felt a chill run down my spine. The wolf's movement was deliberate, calculated. It wasn't acting like any wolf I'd ever encountered. Abigail was worried. She suggested we call someone for help, maybe a wildlife expert or even the local authorities. I agreed, but when I tried to reach out, the wolf was always gone by the time they arrived. It was as if it knew exactly when and where to appear and disappear. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just a random occurrence. It felt like it was part of some larger, sinister pattern. One evening, I was out on the porch, trying to calm my nerves with a drink, when I saw the wolf again. This time, it was much closer, almost right up against the fence. I called out to it, hoping to scare it off, but it just stared back. I noticed something strange. It seemed to be waiting, almost as if it was anticipating something. My gut told me this was more than just a strange animal encounter. The more I tried to understand the wolf's behavior, the more I felt like I was being drawn into something I couldn't control. Every shadow, every rustle in the night, every flicker of movement in the corner of my eye made me jump. The wolf was no longer just a nuisance. It had become a constant source of fear and anxiety. I needed answers, but the more I searched for them, the more elusive they became. The days turned into weeks, and the wolf's presence became unbearable. It was always there, lurking in the shadows, watching us. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Abigail tried to stay positive, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She started to avoid going outside alone, and I couldn't blame her. Each night I lay awake, listening for any sound, any indication that it was near. One night, after an exhausting day at work, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I grabbed my rifle and headed out into the woods. I wasn't planning to shoot the wolf. I just needed to confront it, to understand what it wanted. As I stepped into the trees, a deep feeling of unease settled over me. The forest felt different, almost alive with tension. I walked for a while, calling out to the wolf. The night was silent except for the crunch of leaves under my feet. Then, from behind a cluster of trees, I saw it. The wolf stood still, its eyes gleaming in the moonlight. This time it didn't back away. Instead, it slowly approached me, maintaining that unnerving gaze. My heart raced as it came closer. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. When it was just a few feet away, I finally spoke. "What do you want?" My voice trembled, but I needed to know. The wolf tilted its head, almost as if it understood. It took another step forward, and suddenly everything changed. I felt a rush of memories flood back. Images of Abigail and me working together, laughing and living our lives. In that moment, I realized the wolf wasn't just a creature. It was a symbol of something deeper, a connection to the wild and untamed side of nature. Before I could process this revelation, the wolf turned and ran deeper into the woods. I hesitated for a moment, feeling an urge to follow. I chased after it, my heart pounding. The forest blurred around me as I navigated the trees, desperate to keep it in sight. The deeper I went, the more I felt an inexplicable pull, as if I was meant to follow. Finally, I stumbled into a clearing. The moon illuminated a small, makeshift memorial. My breath caught in my throat. It was adorned with flowers and mementos. I understood now. This place was significant, a tribute to someone who had once been loved and lost. The wolf returned, standing at the edge, watching me with those same intense eyes. It all made sense. This wasn't just a wolf. It was a guardian, a reminder of the connections we have with the wild and with each other. In that moment, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I had uncovered a mystery that would stay with me forever.